You're lying on a wooden deck in the middle of the North Atlantic. It's pitch black. Salt spray keeps hitting your face, and it's already turning to ice the second it lands. Your feet went numb hours ago. The man next to you hasn't moved in a while, and you're starting to wonder if he's just sleeping, or if he's something worse. This is a Viking ship. No cabin. No walls. No fire that can survive the wind. Just open water, open sky, and 40 or 50 men trying to make it to morning. And somehow, most of them did. That's the part that should stop you. Not that Vikings sailed through freezing nights. Anyone can survive one bad night if they're lucky. The real mystery is that they did it again and again, for weeks at a time across open ocean, in temperatures that kill unprepared people in under an hour. So the question isn't just how did they survive the cold. It's how did the human body, wrapped in wool and animal skin, hold on to enough warmth to make it through a night that should have ended everyone on board. To understand that, you have to stop thinking of Vikings as warriors first. On the water at night, they weren't fighters. They were engineers of survival, running a system most people today couldn't last 2 hours inside. Picture the ship itself. It's long, narrow, and shockingly open. No deck cabins like later sailing ships. No enclosed sleeping quarters. Just a hull, a mast, some rope, and men. The wind doesn't just blow past you out here. It moves through you. Every gap in your clothing becomes a highway for cold air straight to your skin. And the ocean at night doesn't just look black. It radiates cold upward, pulling heat out of every exposed inch of your body. Now here's the part that surprises people. Vikings weren't just tough. They were prepared in a way that modern people rarely are, because their entire culture was built around one unforgiving fact. The sea doesn't forgive mistakes. Before they ever stepped onto that ship, they were already solving the cold problem on land. Wool was everywhere, not just as a fabric, but as a survival technology. Viking wool wasn't like the itchy sweater in your closet. It was tightly woven, often treated with natural oils from the sheep's own wool called lanolin, which made it partially water-resistant. That single detail mattered more than most people realize. Wet clothing kills faster than cold air ever could, because water pulls heat away from skin 25 times faster than air does. A wool cloak that resisted soaking through wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between waking up in the morning and not waking up at all. But here's what scientists actually found when they started studying Norse textile remains more closely. The layering wasn't random. It followed a logic almost identical to what modern cold-weather survival experts recommend today. A base layer close to the skin to trap warmth, a looser layer to hold air, and an outer layer to block wind and water. Vikings were doing this 1,000 years before anyone wrote it down in a manual. They didn't need a manual. They had generations of people who died learning the hard way, and those lessons got passed down as instinct. Think about that for a second. Everything they knew about staying alive on a freezing ship came from watching people fail. Every detail in their clothing, every habit around sleeping position, every trick for keeping blood moving in frozen fingers, was written not in books, but in bodies, in deaths, in the kind of knowledge that only exists because someone paid for it first. And that's where the first real hook comes in. Because what you're about to hear flips everything most people assume about how Vikings handled the cold. It wasn't about being brave. It wasn't about gritting your teeth and pushing through pain. Survival on those ships depended on something almost the opposite of toughness: cooperation, timing, and constant small adjustments most people would never think to make. Sleeping on a Viking ship wasn't really sleeping the way you think of it. It was closer to controlled shutdown. Men didn't spread out to get personal space. They packed together tightly because body heat was currency. Group warmth wasn't a comfort choice. It was math. 2 bodies pressed together lose heat slower than 2 bodies lying apart. 10 bodies clustered under shared cloaks and sealskins can create a pocket of warmth that no single sleeper could ever produce alone. This is where the first connection to modern psychology comes in, and it's a strange one. Humans today still do this without realizing it. Watch how people sit closer together in cold rooms, how strangers huddle at bus stops in winter, how people in emergencies instinctively cluster instead of spreading out. That instinct isn't learned. It's ancient. It's the same wiring that kept Viking crews alive on the water. Your body still remembers a version of survival that your mind has mostly forgotten. But packing together brought its own danger. If one man got sick, or worse, if one man was already dying quietly beside the others, nobody always noticed in time. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself loudly. Creeps. Confusion sets in before pain does. A man freezing to death often doesn't shiver anymore in the final stage. The body gives up trying. Some victims even feel a strange, false warmth right before the end. A phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, where the body's blood vessels suddenly dilate and trick the brain into believing it's warm. Viking sailors likely didn't have a name for this, but they had almost certainly seen it. A crewmate calm, quiet, maybe even pulling at his own cloak, moments before the cold finally took him. That's the kind of detail history books rarely mention, because it's not glorious. It's not the image of a Viking standing proud on the bow of a ship. It's the image of a group of exhausted men, packed shoulder to shoulder, watching each other breathe in the dark, checking who's still shivering and who's gone still. Here's another piece of evidence that surprises people. Archaeologists studying Norse ship burials and coastal settlements have found that Vikings didn't just rely on wool and body heat. They used something called a halfguffa-style oiled leather covering, thick treated hides stretched across parts of the ship to block wind during storms. On longer voyages, some ships carried portable stone hearths, small enough to sit inside a metal or stone tray, allowing for brief, carefully controlled fires even on open water. This wasn't common and it wasn't safe, but when conditions allowed, a small fire wasn't just for warmth. It was for morale, for cooking, and for keeping frostbite at bay in fingers and toes, the parts of the body that fail first. Frostbite, more than outright freezing, was probably the real enemy on these voyages. Fingers lose circulation fast in extreme cold, because the body prioritizes keeping the core organs warm over the extremities. That means hands and feet are sacrificed first, biologically speaking, to protect the heart, lungs, and brain. Vikings would have known this instinctively, even without understanding the biology behind it. Historical accounts and skeletal remains show evidence of amputated or missing digits in many Norse burial sites. A quiet, physical record of just how brutal these voyages really were. Ask yourself something here. If you woke up tomorrow and lost 2 fingers to frostbite, would you consider that a normal risk of your life? For a Viking sailor, it might have been just another Tuesday. That's the second hook, the reframe. Because up until this point, most people imagine Vikings as unstoppable warriors who simply didn't feel the cold the way we do. But what you're really looking at is a culture that normalized suffering most modern humans would consider catastrophic. They weren't immune to pain. They were just forced to live alongside it constantly, and that changes how a person experiences fear itself. This is the second connection to modern psychology, and it's an important one. Repeated exposure to controlled discomfort actually changes how the brain processes stress. Modern research on cold exposure and resilience training shows that people who regularly face manageable hardship, cold showers, physical endurance training, even structured fasting, develop a measurably different stress response than people who avoid discomfort altogether. Vikings didn't have gyms or wellness retreats. Their entire existence was cold exposure training, forced by geography and necessity. Their nervous systems adapted because they had no other option. What you're about to hear next was mostly buried, not because historians hid it on purpose, but because it doesn't fit the image people want Vikings to have. This is the mid-script reset. This is where the story stops being about toughness and starts being about something darker. Not every man survived these nights, and not every death was treated the same way. On long voyages, especially raiding expeditions or trade routes across open sea, resources were limited. Space was limited. Every scrap of dry wool, every warm spot near another body, was contested territory, even if nobody said it out loud. Historical Norse sagas, stories passed down and eventually written centuries later, hint at brutal decisions made on these ships. Weaker crew members, the sick, the injured, sometimes the very young apprentices brought along to learn seafaring, were not always given the same access to warmth as senior warriors. This wasn't written down as cruelty. It was written as practicality. A dying man doesn't need the warm spot as much as a healthy one who still has work to do come morning. Sit with that for a second. On a modern ship or even in a modern hospital, resources are still triaged in emergencies. Doctors call it triage, treating those most likely to survive first, sometimes at the expense of those less likely to make it. Vikings were doing an unspoken version of this 1,000 years earlier, not with medical training, but with cold, brutal logic learned through repetition. Keep the ship's strength intact. Protect those who can row, who can fight, who can carry the group forward. The weak, unfortunately, sometimes became the price of that survival. There's also evidence, pulled from burial practices along Old Norse trade and raiding routes, that not every sailor who died at sea was brought home. Some were given what's called a sea burial, simply released into the water, sometimes without ceremony, especially during long voyages where returning a body wasn't practical. Other times, bodies were kept aboard until landfall, wrapped in what spare cloth could be found, not out of sentiment necessarily, but because Norse religious beliefs placed enormous importance on proper burial rites for the journey to the afterlife. Leaving someone unburied wasn't just sad. It was spiritually catastrophic in their worldview. This tension, between practical survival and deep religious duty, created enormous pressure on crews during long freezing voyages. Do you keep rowing to protect the living, or do you slow down to properly honor the dead? There wasn't always a clean answer. Here's a moment that should make you question your own instincts. If you were on that ship, cold, exhausted, barely functioning, and the man next to you stopped breathing in the middle of the night, what would you actually do? Modern instinct says stop everything, alert someone, try to help. But on a ship with 50 exhausted sailors, in freezing wind, in complete darkness, waking the whole crew to deal with a death that's already happened might do more harm than good. Vikings likely learned, brutally, that sometimes the correct action was to wait until morning. To let the body stay where it was until first light. Not because they didn't care, because moving in the dark, disturbing sleeping bodies desperately clinging to shared warmth, could put everyone else at greater risk. That single decision, waiting until morning to deal with death, tells you everything about how differently these people had to think compared to modern humans. Grief had to be postponed. Emotion had to be managed like a resource rationed carefully, because panic burned energy the body couldn't spare. This is the third connection to modern psychology, and maybe the most unsettling one. Humans today still do a quieter version of this. Emergency responders, soldiers, ICU nurses, professionals who face repeated exposure to death, often describe a kind of emotional compartmentalization almost identical to what Norse sailors likely experienced. Feel it later. Function now. It's not coldness. It's a survival mechanism built the same way, whether you're on a freezing ship in 900 AD or in a hospital hallway today. Now here's where the story gets even darker, and this is the piece most people never hear. Some historical and archaeological evidence suggests that during especially brutal winter voyages, particularly ones that ran longer than expected due to storms or navigation, errors, food, and warmth scarcity pushed crews into decisions that modern audiences would find deeply disturbing. There are Norse accounts, some legendary, some grounded in real events, describing situations where the sickest or weakest members of a crew were deliberately left exposed to the elements rather than sheltered, essentially a slow, unspoken form of sacrifice to conserve resources for the rest. This wasn't standard practice. It wasn't celebrated. But it happened in extreme cases when the alternative was losing the entire crew. Some historians argue this reflects a broader pattern seen across nearly every extreme survival culture in human history, from stranded explorers to shipwreck survivors centuries later. When resources run low enough, and death becomes mathematically certain for everyone unless sacrifices are made, human groups have repeatedly, quietly, made the same brutal calculation. Save the many by abandoning the few. It's uncomfortable to hear. It should be. But this is what real survival often looked like, stripped of the romanticism modern culture wraps around Viking history. These weren't just brave warriors sailing into glory. They were human beings making impossible choices in freezing darkness, choices that modern comfort makes almost unimaginable. And that impossible math didn't only apply to the sick. Weather itself sometimes forced choices that feel almost too cruel to say out loud. Storms could last for days. Ships could get pushed far off course, sometimes weeks longer than intended supplies could support. In these situations, rationing became severe. Fresh water especially, more than food, became the limiting factor. A human body can survive weeks without food if it has to. It cannot survive more than a few days without water, and freezing temperatures actually increase the body's water needs, because the body burns extra energy, and therefore extra hydration just trying to stay warm. This means some of the most dangerous nights on a Viking ship weren't necessarily the coldest ones. They were the ones that came after days without proper water, when judgment was already failing, when hands were already shaking from dehydration on top of cold, when men were making decisions about who got shelter and who didn't, with minds that weren't fully functioning anymore. Modern research on decision-making under extreme stress supports something chilling here. As dehydration and exhaustion increase, the brain's prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for empathy, patience, and long-term reasoning, becomes less active. Meanwhile, the more primal parts of the brain, focused purely on immediate survival, take over. In plain terms, exhausted, freezing, dehydrated humans become less capable of compassion, not because they're bad people, but because their biology is quite literally shutting down the parts of the brain that make room for it. Vikings on these ships weren't just fighting the ocean. They were fighting their own collapsing humanity night after night, trying to hold onto enough judgment to keep the group alive without losing what made them people in the first place. This is the final escalation, the part most documentaries skip entirely. Survival on a freezing Viking ship wasn't a single skill. It was a constant negotiation between body and mind, between individual survival instinct and group loyalty, between the version of yourself that wants to live and the version that has to decide, sometimes, who else gets to live too. And here's the twist that should sit with you longest. The Vikings who made it home weren't necessarily the strongest, or even the smartest. Often, they were simply the ones who managed to stay calm enough, long enough, to make one good decision after another, night after night, without breaking under the weight of what they were seeing and doing. That's not so different from you. Modern life doesn't put most people on a freezing ship in the middle of the ocean. But it does test the same internal system again and again in smaller, quieter ways. Stress at work, financial pressure, emotional exhaustion, moments where panic feels like the only option, and staying calm feels almost impossible. The wiring Vikings relied on to survive literal freezing nights is the same wiring still running inside you right now, mostly untested, mostly asleep, waiting for a version of crisis your ancestors would recognize instantly, even if you don't. So the next time you're lying awake at night, stressed about something that feels overwhelming, ask yourself something uncomfortable. If you had been on that ship, packed shoulder to shoulder with exhausted strangers, freezing wind cutting through wet wool, watching the man beside you go quiet in the dark, would you have made it to morning? And if you had, what parts of yourself would you have had to leave behind out there, somewhere in the freezing black water, just to survive the night?